Welcome back to another episode of That's Business. Today's guest is a client turned very good friend, Darren. Now, Darren, we've talked about this podcast. I think I've bullied you, for like 2 years now?
Yeah, at least 2 years. At least 2 years. Going on 3, I think.
Something like that, right? But I'm so excited to have this conversation because when we first met, client referred from Tiffany, if you listen to that episode, Twiz Creative, and just seeing the progression without spoiling what we'll talk about now on your journey of entrepreneurship. But before we dive into what you're up to now, we're throwing it back to childhood. Were you always this leader? Knew you wanted to go into leadership? Or what was your childhood like? You feel comfortable telling us?
I do, actually. I wanted to be an astronaut. I think everybody that knows me knows I wanted to be an astronaut.
Nice.
And I don't know. I just always loved exploration and space. And honestly, looking back, my mom was a Trekkie. And she watched all the Star Trek and I always resonated with Captain Kirk. I always wanted to lead a starship. So I think I did kind of resonate with leadership off the bat. I got a big Star Trek mug that I drink out of from time to time. So I I'm on the bridge and everything. So it's pretty cool. So I've always wanted to be an astronaut and I love space exploration. I'm still interested in space.
I did not know that about you. That's awesome.
Yeah, fun fact.
That's great. Wanting to be an astronaut, did that lead you through high school and post high school and all, or where do we kind of change paths there?
I changed paths, I think, in high school. I got interested in biology and things like that, when I was in high school. And I was leaning more towards medical and going in the medical field. And then I actually ended up going to the military in a surprise move. So I kind of actually got closer to being the astronaut than the doctor. So, some of the things that I did throughout aviation and things like that in the military. So,
did you come from a military family, or where did the huge decision to join the military come from?
No, my dad was a police officer, and I have a couple of uncles that served in the different branches of the military, but I was the only Marine. And actually, my dad's cousin got drafted into the Marines during Vietnam. Ended up being killed in action and ended up, it was my dad's best friend. I never knew this story until I was getting ready to go to deploy for the first time. My dad told me, hey, make sure you come back because, he told me that his cousin didn't come back. So it's kind of a sad story, but I did have people in my family that served kind of traditionally. And I just kind of had that call and ended up going. So
what a good send-off story. Hey, son, don't go.
Right? Yeah.
Come back.
Yeah, make sure you come back. So
the anxiety you probably gave that man, but
yeah,
that's okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
So talking about deciding to go Marines, because a lot of people that don't come from military backgrounds or don't always understand the difference between branches or how you decide that. So what made you choose Marines?
I think what drew me to it was the culture. And that's still what some of what I'll share about my business too, deals with the culture of the Marine Corps. And it was the one to me that was closer to the warrior culture. So that always interested me too, samurai and Spartans and Zulu and, these different warrior cultures around the world that we kind of know that these traditions are passed down. The Marine Corps has similar aspects to it. That's what interests me and called me to it. Everybody says it's the hardest one. It's the hardest because we say it's the hardest. And if you try to dispute us on it, we'll fight you. So it's yeah, it's the hardest, man. I don't want to fight.
You're right. You're right. It's good. It's good. Right.
So.
Okay. So when you enlisted, walk us through, because you said you got into aviation and also what was your specialty? Because you served, it was 20 years? Or am I making that up?
No, I served just under 15 years active duty.
15. Okay.
Yeah. And then I did reserve time with the Air National Guard as well in Indiana. But my specialty was avionics on the helicopters. So I worked on what's called a CH-53 Echo Sea Stallion, which is a big cargo lift plane. Did infill, exfil missions. We did cargo lifts, missions, and all types of different. So, you always see that helicopter that's picking up the tanks and things like that. That's the CH-53 Sea Stallion. So shipboard operations, the whole nine. So, I remember Top Gun. The first Top Gun came out when I was a kid. So that was another movie that just kind of inspired me towards military and aviation and things like that as well. And I actually got to work on that base, Miramar, where that was filmed. So that was pretty cool.
Really?
Yeah.
Didn't know that either.
Yeah, that was our station. Yeah, absolutely.
That should be your fun fact if it's not already. I feel like you have a lot of fun facts. So we'll see what stories you want to tell and not tell. But
right. Yeah, I have a couple. Well, I can always come back on. So
yes, of course. So, and because it's interesting too, because you served 15 years, almost or just under 15, as you said, and then you got an Air National Guard. So what made you kind of commit to that period of time? Because that's a long chunk of your life to do that same job in, but what made you kind of stay in, whereas some people I know do their 4, get out and things like that?
Right. Well, you had, 9/11 happened, of course, and it just became a calling. It was like that was our time to serve, and that was our conflict, our war, so to speak, for our generation. So that was kind of the driving force of the day, and, the recruiting numbers and all that kind of stuff, and boat spaces have to be filled, which are just, personnel staffing things that need to be done. So there was more jobs to do. So I actually got to do a little bit more than aviation while I was in as well. I got to go and work for a couple of generals, and I got to go serve forward with them, and it was a good time. So it was just a lot more opportunity at the time within the military that came up just because of the conflicts. I know that sounds kind of crazy to outside to probably, yeah, it is true.
Right.
That like more duties and more jobs come up because it's during wartime. So more things had to be done. When you're in at the time, that's the mission, and the mission is the focus of the military. So stayed in. So,
yeah.
Stayed as long as I could.
Right. That's great. Now, transitioning out, what was your transition period going back into a corporate role? How was your transition for you?
I would say it was bumpy and rocky at best. I think when I transitioned out, it was 2013. And, a lot of the military transition programs and things like that weren't online yet. I would say it's a lot better now than it was. And, military recruiters and things like that weren't really speaking the language of civilian recruiters. I think that disconnect has been, kind of repaired in recent job searches that I've had. I've just seen the language change. I've just seen the requirements and things like that change. But when I got out, everybody wanted a 4-year degree with 20 years experience. You know what I mean? Like it's, for entry level position, that was kind of the climate of the day, and your military experience didn't really, count. I was very lucky to find, a position where they took a chance on me because of my military and managerial background, especially when it comes to operations. And I worked for a company that worked with General Motors and managed the facilities. So I got to work at General Motors, Fort Wayne Assembly Plant for a couple of years, and really learned a lot about buildings and construction and maintenance and all those types of things that I've, made a career out of after the military. And I kind of went into the construction industry and ended up going over to the lighting industry and the lighting controls, specialized. And from there, I just come to start my own business now. So that's why we're here, right?
That's why we're here. Hey, I wanted you on before you even started your own business. So
that is true. That is true. Yeah, that is very true.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Come on, Darren. Come on.
Yeah.
So making the jump, because this has been so fun to see this journey. So just a little background from my point of view. Like we said, we met a few years ago, hit it off, and it's so funny because I'm like, okay, how are you not doing your own thing yet? You're like, well, I do want to do my own thing eventually, but I don't know, like when I'm ready.
Right.
And then over the last few months, like Darren's been texting me like, okay, I'm like doing it. Like I'm coming on the podcast. We're doing it. And then what was it like 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago?
Yeah.
I'm in the middle of moving and I look at my watch and I just see a text from Darren. Hey, I'm quitting Friday, just an FYI. And I'm like, hell yeah, let's go. Like, let's do it.
Right.
And again, you can talk about whatever you want or don't want to, but what got you to the point of quitting? And I want to talk about Washington and everything that's been going on with that. So
right. Yeah.
Something I admire you for this year is you're like, you know what? I'm going to do things for me, do what's best for me, continue the healing journey. And that's a huge step because a lot of people don't do that.
Right. Yeah.
Tell us what's been going on the last few months that led you to screw it, I'm doing my own thing now.
Yeah, it really was the healing process, like you mentioned, Angela. I mean, it was me coming to terms with the long operations, the combat operational stress, the PT. And, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress syndrome, from my combat duties, and coming to terms with that, just how, like debilitating the illness actually is and what it did to me over the years of just bottling it up and not dealing with it. I'd been in counseling on and off, but I really never took my healing journey to the next level. And in the last, I would say 2 or 3 years, I started, really taking it seriously and kind of coming up with an action plan and working with a social worker through the VA. I got back in talk therapy and just kind of leveled up there. And then I went over to art therapy class, which was like my first like group setting as far as, healing goes, and talking about feelings, wasn't something that a Marine did, you know what I mean? And it was just very eye-opening to get into that group setting and, do art, and either talk about what's going on or not talk about it, but still feeling comfortable in that space with other veterans who were going through similar struggles. And I could see myself in each of their journeys. It just kind of propelled me to go forward even further in my journey. And a few years ago, I was, introduced to a service dog program called Northwest Battle Buddies through, my best friend, John Watkins, who lives out in Washington State. And that's where the program is. And he said, hey, you might want to do this. And I didn't really, ever thought I would have a dog. I had a dog when I was like a kid and, it got sold and things like that. And my parents never really talked about it with us. And now that was just kind of hurt from that. Even as a child, I was like the angry, grumpy kid after that. And I, identify with characters like Mr. T and, Grumpy Smurf and all that stuff, if we're going back to childhood.
Yeah.
But I remember that just being mad because, my parents got rid of my dog and didn't tell me, you know what I mean? Like I was a boy missing his dog. And I felt like I've gotten some of that back this year by going through the program. And now I have my service dog, Ava, who's English Lab. And if you go on my LinkedIn or anything like that, you'll see, or my Instagram, you'll see pictures of her popping up. But she's great. And she just keeps me grounded and, keeps my head on straight. And I think it was that next level of healing that I needed. And also I was there. I got to, go on some hikes and meet some other veterans and just that brotherhood that to me doesn't exist on that level in the civilian world that, people who have been to combat and people who haven't been to combat. And I'm not, picking at anybody, but it's just that brotherhood's unspoken, to where I know for a fact, they would run into a burning building to save me, you know what I mean? Or
Right.
anybody else, or we're running together to save everybody else. And we're not leaving without each other. That brotherhood just sparked me to start my business, because that's what my business is all about, is bringing some of that same brotherhood and esprit de corps and, and value-based leadership to the civilian workforce, because I think there's a lack of it. And, the leadership is just lacking, in my opinion. Pretty sure you've had a bad boss or two in your time.
Ooh, yep. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's going to be my podcast, is everybody come on and talk about their good bosses and bad bosses. So,
Yes.
or to toss that around. So,
Well, and what you approach it differently and with your sales background too. And I love what you're doing, because everyone has a bad boss story.
right.
And especially why people leave jobs. I mean, yes, if the job's crappy, you get laid off, fine, you leave it. But most of the time people leave because of bad managers or bad people.
Right.
I know we've bonded over our bad bosses too, but it's so interesting because that's the hard part, the hard decision of, well, I love my coworkers, but I hate my boss. And well, if it wasn't for my coworkers, I would have left, years ago and things like that. So
Right.
because, and we've bonded over this too, there's so many people in sales training, there's so many career coaches and resume writers and everything too. But
Right.
what makes what you're doing different? And explain the name and explain how you came up with it, because I love it and the branding is so on point. But go ahead.
So Mameluke Sales Leadership is my company. The name is pronounced Mameluke. It's right behind me. It's based off of the sword. So the Mameluke sword was gifted to a lieutenant after the Battle of Derna in Tripoli. So from the shores of Tripoli, the Marines hymn, from the shores of Tripoli, they're talking about that time that
Oh, yeah.
they're
Mhm.
singing about that time that the Mameluke sword was presented to Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon as a result of the Marines' fighting spirit during that battle. He was inspired. He gifted him a sword. And then soon after that, the commandant, Grand Old Man of the Marine Corps named Archibald Henderson, who was commandant for, 40 something odd years, which is a long tenure, he made it the official sword for all the Marine officers. So it's just a symbol of leadership for the Marine Corps. It represents, taking on that lead and being the tip of the spear, being that sharp leader that you can be, being that shining beacon, that everybody can look to for leadership. And that sword just symbolizes that.
Talking through what you're going through of how you want to address leadership in a different way. So what have been your experiences, what you feel comfortable telling without naming names,
Absolutely.
but what has been your experience with leadership and why you came up with this idea?
Well, most people lead based off of how they were led. And that can create cycles of abuse within organizations, which that's not good for anybody. Even if an organization breaks off from another organization to make their own similar agency or something like that, they can still bring those same problems and leadership styles with them if they don't address them. So the Mameluke Mindful Method is a values-based leadership method. It involves principles and traits based off of the Marine Corps leaderships and traits and principles that I learned while I was serving. And I've also applied to teams that I've led after the Marine Corps. And it's been very effective every single time. I've gotten the results that were needed and exceeded them. So I've basically taken that and I've compiled that with these mindfulness techniques, such as meditation, affirmations, and also journaling and things like that. So you can really bring in what you want, and it helps your planning process as well.
Wow. So with your own experiences in leadership, and I know we've talked more on the corporate side, but I love that you call this out because you lead based on how you were led. And I remember like a good friend of mine, he had said, well, my leaders in the Army were bad. So I wanted to be good for, like, I'm a good leader because my leaders were bad, or I'm a bad leader because my leaders were bad. It's just like what route you want to go, So,
right. Absolutely.
Or the concept of like, I drink, I'm an alcoholic because my father was an alcoholic, or I don't drink because my father was an alcoholic. It's like what route you want to go. So what made you have that transition? And not to say you had bad leaders, but you could have easily said like, oh, not my problem, on to the next one, like a lot of people do.
Right. Well, for me, when you have values like honor, courage, and commitment are the Marine Corps core values. A lot of companies have their core values, but they're very, what I call thin. They're thinly placed on their website and kind of forgotten about and swept under the rug. Well, the Marine Corps charges us to live by these. And at any point in time, I can call a Marine out on, hey, you're not being very honorable. Hey, you're not having very much courage right now. Hey, you're not very committed. And that really shapes the culture itself. So I think that's the part that's missing, is that culture that's infused with the values. People just write their values and write their, put on their mission statement. No, a mission statement, that's the mission. And, everybody in the entire organization needs to understand that mission, and their part that they play in it is very critical. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a position there. So that's where this comes in. It teaches you the how, what, and why to lead. So that's where it's a little bit different than some of the other systems that may be out there. It teaches you, why am I doing this? As a leader, not from the perspective of the person being led.
When you're kind of helping people, is it whole organizations? Is it one-on-one coaching? Or tell us more about who your, I hate to say this word, but I'm not going to say niche. I will say ideal clients.
Ideal client, yeah.
Like who you ideally like to help or want to help.
So a couple of things that I can do. So one-on-one counseling, absolutely. That's pretty much the easiest, because if you have someone who wants to be a stronger leader or a stronger salesperson, I can really help them nail down the details of their lives that can, affect the other things that they may be doing right or wrong in their relationships. They just have to give me a lot more information as far as, the teams that they're working on, the projects they're working on, things like that. So I can definitely help with the one-on-one coaching. That's one offering. And then we can take it up a level, and I can meet with either the entire team, as a session, or I can meet with them in several sessions and then meet with everybody one-on-one as well. And then that allows me, that's kind of the ideal situation, is to work with small teams that maybe have a little bit of coordination or a little bit of dysfunction there. We're trying to root out the problem, or just trying to get things to figure out the process so things can run more smoothly between teams as well. So that's where I can be very, helpful. And, the systems that we teach at Mameluke can be very helpful with organizations, because everybody's learning the same value-based systems, and then they learn how to apply that to their day-to-day jobs. And that's where it can be very effective, because it gets everybody thinking on the same line of values, the same leadership traits, the same principles. So there's always a discussion around those, and also around the work and how the work is applied to those.
Something we were laughing about, of course, was there's like the sales leadership, or I'll get you the ROI and I'll do this and you'll just be building such big pipelines. But you're not approaching it that way. Thinking about core values, no one talks about and nobody's thinking about, like what did you say? You said thin?
They're thin, yeah.
Yeah, they're thin, right?
Yeah.
So approaching this differently now, without giving away all your trade secrets, but how is the program, let's say you're working with a small team, how are you instilling these values in these people to be better leaders? And then if it is like a sales specific team, to build out and leading to more business, things like that.
A common thing that I would do, when having discussions with sales teams that I've been on, especially if there's a disagreement, like you put a chair over there and you mark it as customer. And that's what this does. But if you're familiar with that technique, and what that does is it makes people think about what they're saying as if the customer is there. So all of a sudden the language gets, toned down a little bit. The tempers get toned down a little bit, and everybody kind of backs off and says, okay, let's think about this from if I was sitting in that seat, if that's the person listening. So what this does, it takes a value like, say, loyalty. Let's put loyalty in the seat today, and we'll talk about this negotiation when in context of loyalty itself, or tact, or some of these other traits, or judgment, or justice, or any of these different traits. You can take it out and put it in the chair and say, let's talk about sales within that context of loyalty. So how loyal has this customer been to us in the past? How loyal have we been to that customer in our customer service relationships? How loyal have we been with pricing? So you can take one trait out and really dissect it. And it's 14 of them. And I'm not going to, again, give away the gravy here.
Of course not.
But we can talk about each one of those within the context of the discussion, and it brings a whole new light and whole new layer to it.
So where are we going with this now? So we started this, and I hate the whole where you want to be in a few years, but how big do you want to blow this up, or what are your dreams and aspirations for Mameluke?
Well, I'm coming up with an online course right now. That's what's in the works. First, it'll be a small seminar offered. That'll be it's running about 2.5 hours. So any salesperson or sales team or leader or manager can jump on there and purchase that course. That'll be available on the website, hopefully in the next month after this airs.
Yes.
And then after that, we'll release a 13 module course. It's meant to mimic the 13 weeks of boot camp, because in boot camp for the Marine Corps is 13 weeks, and you learn a different skill set every different week. And that's exactly what we do with the Mameluke's mindful method. That'll be 13 weeks as well, 13 modules meant to run 13 weeks. So,
oh my gosh, that's so great. I love this.
But I do want to do webinars. I do want to do more in-person things, just as far as it takes me. I'm just going with the universe right now.
Listening to the universe. She will give back.
All right.
Now, as we wrap this up, what advice do you have for listeners outside of the incredible pieces you've already given us?
Well, for listeners, really think about the decisions that you make and find ways to de-stress. I mean, this has really come out of me healing and finding peace and understanding who I am again. I have a sales mentor. His name's Charlie Brown. I wouldn't go without mentioning him. But he's a Vietnam veteran, and he took me under his wing back in 2013 when I first got out of the military. And he told me, he was like, Darren, you're going to be a salesman. I wasn't even sales. I was still in operations. I was facility operations at the time. He's like, Darren, you're going to be a salesman one day, and you're going to be one hell of a salesman. He's like, but you got to know who the fuck you are before you can do it.
Oh my gosh, how impactful. Holy shit.
And I was like, whew. I thought I knew who I was, but looking back 12 years ago now, I didn't know who I was. And that's the same with being a leader. I knew who I was in the context of a leader, being inside the Marine Corps. I was a gunnery sergeant. You had the rank, you had the position, you had the titles. But outside of that, I had no idea. I had no idea as a civilian who I was. So my advice to listeners is you can lead or sell or do anything you want to do. You just have to know who you are. You have to know who the fuck you are, according to Charlie Brown. So,
according to Charlie Brown. What a name. What amazing.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
Now, and Darren is going to start a podcast, and Darren's going to talk through that. So head to the show notes if you want to work with Darren, follow along his journey, and just work with the incredible human that he is. And tune in again next week for another episode of That's Business.
If you're looking for a career change and you're not sure where to start, the Resume Rescue can help. Sure, there's no such thing as the perfect fit for everyone, but here at the Resume Rescue, we're on a mission to find the perfect solution for you. Whether it's changing careers, updating a resume, learning LinkedIn, or practicing interviewing, we have you covered. Find us online at theresumerescue.com and find all of our contact info in our show notes.